I need to go online.
There's a lot more, Dr. Hauser. Just picked one.
I don't look because I'm one of the last free men in America. I do not own a computer or a cell phone. I never have. And people say, how do you live? Exactly the way you did in 1972. Well, enough about me. I want to talk about George Washington, and specifically about the farewell address, because that's what they advertised, and if I talk about anything else, you'll feel cheated. But I need to set it in time and place for you, and especially put it in the proper mindset. And what I mean by that is, you have a man who has served his country in one capacity or another for decades, going back to the French and Indian War, and he was a household name. If ever there was a household name in colonial and early America, it would have been George Washington. In fact, I don't think the Constitution would ever have been adopted had not George Washington been assumed to be the first president of the United States under the Constitution. There was great fear that establishing a constitution with a chief executive would lead to a new despotism, creation of another royal family. Remember, the terms of the presidency were unlimited in those days, no limit on a presidential term of office. But when it was heard that George Washington might be the man to fill that chair initially, that was the deal maker. The Constitution was adopted by the various states, by Delaware first, Pennsylvania, and then all the way through till finally the very contentious states of North Carolina and Rhode Island. Rhode Island actually considered becoming an independent republic for a while. Rhode Island. They weren't going to join at one point. They thought the big states would beat up on the little fellow on the block. Being the smallest state, if you've ever driven across Rhode Island, you kind of sneeze and you miss it. They figured they would be independent from the United States, which might have, by the way, been a gold mine for them. They could have been an early version of Las Vegas. You know, what happens in Rhode Island stays in Rhode Island. You know, it might have not done much for the local culture, but they could have made a fortune by being the sort of gambling and vice haven of the North American continent. But they did eventually join. Well, all of them joined because of George Washington. The other founders were not as universally admired as we might nowadays imagine. Thomas Jefferson was considered a radical by some, even though he'd written the Declaration of Independence. If you read Thomas Paine's Common Sense and then read Jefferson's Declaration, it's clear that he got more ideas from Paine than he did from Locke. And a lot of what he got from Locke, he got by way of Paine, if you want to read those two back to back. And then there was John Adams, whom nobody particularly liked, rather contentious fellow. A few years ago, when I talked about John Adams, I would make a contemporary comparison, comparing him to Tony Randall in The Odd Couple. It's no longer a contemporary reference. Yeah. Nobody gets that anymore. And I don't think that's even in reruns on MeTV any longer. But at any rate, the other founders didn't have this universal appeal that Washington did. Washington was seen as a selfless individual who put country above his own interests. Now, that's an exaggeration to some extent because none of us are that good. But it was fundamentally true. So now, George Washington has served 2 terms as president. He has decided that he wishes to leave office. It is 1796, an election year, the Electoral College choosing the president more directly in those days. And in September of 1796, he writes a farewell to the American people. Now, I know there are a lot of revisionist historians who tell you, oh, he didn't write that. John Adams wrote it, Alexander Hamilton wrote it, John Jay wrote it. I've heard every name in the book. They did assist. There isn't a single president who doesn't get somebody giving him some input into what he's going to say. That was true then, it's true now. Now it's more true than it was then. Speeches are written by others. But Washington did indeed serve as the backbone of his own farewell address. There's no question, but that those were his thoughts, and in many cases, his actual words. Well, writing a farewell address is one thing today. It was something else back then. Today, we would ask for time on the television networks and deliver it as a speech. Washington's farewell address was never actually delivered as a speech. It was written to be delivered as a speech, but it seemed rather pointless. What was the point in gathering 100 or so people together to deliver these remarks to them? It would have had no greater impact. So it was instead sent out in written form and eventually published in the weekly newspapers throughout the country at that time. And writing it and distributing it, disseminating it as the written word was much more effective than it would have been to simply speak it, because the words would have died. Well, Washington's farewell address represents his best and last advice. And to place yourself in the mindset, as I said a moment ago, you need to think that if you only had one last opportunity to speak to those you loved, what would you tell them? It's something, by the way, which probably should weigh on all of us, because there may come that point in our lives, some sooner rather than later, and we need to know if there's something we wish to leave others with that they need to hear before we depart. Washington wrote the words of the farewell address in 1796. He was dead in 1799. He was not in good health. He knew that better than some others did. He also believed that 2 terms in the presidency was enough. And so he was about to leave the stage. Imagine now yourself in his shoes. What are you going to tell people when you'll never be able to tell them anything ever again? At least nothing they'll ever hear. That's a good question. And he starts, and I'm not going to read the farewell address, don't panic. But he starts by saying, interwoven, as is the love of liberty with every ligament of your hearts, no recommendation of mine is necessary to fortify or confirm the attachment. He dispenses with the issue of freedom and liberty almost immediately. I'm not going to insult you, he says. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by saying you need to be vigorous in your defense of liberty and be a vanguard for freedom. You know that. You just fought a war over exactly that issue. You've seen despotism. You expelled a king from our shores who had become despotic in his rule. I'm not going to waste any time here telling you to love liberty, telling you to be vigilant for freedom. I don't need to do that. You are in love with liberty and freedom. So he compliments his audience initially, and then he moves on from that. But there he begins to make individual points, which I find to be most interesting, some more so than others. And you can tell what's important to Washington by the amount of time he does or doesn't spend on something in the farewell address. There are certain things that he basically confirms his attachment to and moves on, and other things that, frankly, in reading it aloud with my classes, and what I do with my classes is I use primary documents and read them aloud. Because when you assign something to take home, there's a percentage that will never read it, but if they read it in class, they're stuck with it. And so when we read it, I do find there are things that become a bit redundant. And it's because he's trying very hard to make a particular point, more so than he might have with certain other points. The first point that he really makes is the necessity for some level of unity in government, and he sees as a foe of that sectionalism, sectional rivalries. The country was much smaller then than it is now. Remember, this is back even before the Louisiana Purchase. We're just basically dealing with the East Coast. Florida belonged to Spain at that point. We wouldn't acquire that till 1819. And then the area to the west, the Northwest Territories, which would include Wisconsin, by the way, were pretty much unsettled. But there were people moving out there at that time. Well, Washington says, I can see a time arriving where the people of New England will say, what's in the best interest of New England? And the people in the South will say, what is the best interest of the South? And the people in the emerging West, everyone understood, even when it was underpopulated, that the West was the future. The people were going to move out there. There was a large expanse of land, and even without imagining the additional lands we would get, the additional territories that would be annexed, we knew that the future belonged to the West. So Westerners would say, well, we don't live on the coast. What do we care about trade? Southerners would say we have 4 cash crops: cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice. That's where we make our money. And the crops that can't be grown in many places in Europe. So how do we make our money off of those agricultural exports? Now, when you begin to think that way, you begin to look locally for your advantages and not nationally. And Washington said this will ultimately threaten your unity, because everybody will look at what is good for their region or their area or their town or their seaport or whatever it might be, and they will ignore anything else that might possibly benefit another part of the country. We don't care about that. Well, that doesn't affect us. It doesn't interest us. And Washington saw that as a threat to liberty. And he said that would be played upon by demagogues. There would be those who would arise who would suggest in very, very strong terms that one region of the country was more important than another. This is almost prophetic, because it wouldn't be too many years after that that a man by the name of Aaron Burr would attempt to create first a New England Confederacy and later a commonwealth in the Louisiana Territory. Try to take one area away from another. Burr was a man of almost unlimited personal ambition, and if he couldn't run the country, he wanted to run at least part of it. And there would be others who would be undermining the unity of the country for their own self-interest. And Washington saw this as a real threat to the future of America, that this country, being larger at that time even than many of the states of Europe, would ultimately fall apart into geographical division. However, he goes a little further than that, and he gets into something that is one of those issues he hammers to death. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties or factions in the state, with particular references to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid extremities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. He hates political parties. Now, I'm not becoming ideological here. He hates all political parties. He doesn't like any political party. Washington's vision for America and for the democratic process within the confines of the Republic were visions of individuals running for local and federal office as independents. In other words, you want to run for Congress, you put yourself out there as an independent running for Congress, and you state your beliefs. You get on your hind legs, you bark a little bit, you speak your onions, as old Larry the Legend used to say. You tell them the worst and the best, and you decide that you'll let the people figure who to vote for. That's their job, not yours. Run outside of a political party system. Political parties, he said, just foster a spirit of revenge. One party seeks revenge on the other party gets in, then now there's their moment for revenge, and it's back and forth and back and forth. And what's really sad is if one party does come up with a good idea, the other party will feel almost obligated to take the opposite position. Did Washington have a crystal ball? No. Washington instead had to deal with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. As Washington was writing these words, the first two political parties in American history were organizing themselves. The first was the Federalist Party, founded by followers of George Washington, which goes to show how well followers listen to their own leadership. And the second was the Democratic Republican Party, founded by Jeffersonians. There was a great difference. The Federalists inclined toward closer relations with Great Britain. We had just fought a war against Great Britain, and some Americans said, "Are you crazy? It was a few years ago, these people were shooting at us." No, they're our cousins. They read Shakespeare, we read Shakespeare. They speak English, we speak English. We are of the British people. And to a greater extent at that time, this was an Anglo-Saxon nation. There's probably not too many Anglo-Saxons in this room. If your name, or your mother's name was Gundeschwager, you're not an Anglo-Saxon. You're a Goth. If you're named O'Reilly, you're certainly not an Anglo-Saxon. You're a Celt. And don't go into any Irish bar on vacation and tell them it's wonderful to be in an Anglo-Saxon country. You won't make it out of the bar alive. The fact is that we are now very diverse, more so than we realize. But the America of that time was quite Anglo-Saxon. And Adams said, well, we're the same people. We need to get closer to our old British cousins. You know, let bygones be bygones. And also we need to figure manufacturing and trade as our future. The bustling seaports of New England, that's our future. Now, Thomas Jefferson didn't agree. Jefferson believed that the yeoman farmer was the American future. And that every man should own his own 40 acres, have a little piece of the pie. You'll love America a lot more if you own a piece of it. He believed in states' rights. Leave the states alone, let them govern as they will, and the federal government should be rather weak. Adams wanted a stronger federal government, and Jefferson, to top it off, said, why be closer friends with the British? I still don't trust those guys. Our real friends are the French. Now, Jefferson had served as U.S. ambassador in France. It was one of the happiest times of his life, actually. He loved French culture. He loved sitting at the cafes, and he loved French ladies, a little too much in some cases. And he had actually thought of settling there before he was called back into service as Secretary of State under Washington. So Jefferson has a very different vision, and pretty soon everybody who backed Jefferson hates Adams. Not hard to hate anyway. And everybody who backed Adams couldn't stand Jefferson, and there's the nucleus for the creation of the two-party system. Well, Washington's warning against that even as it's happening. He sees what's happening. He says, don't do this. But he also says, you know, it's natural to human nature. It's part of our nature. From the time little kids are in kindergarten, they form their little cliques. I like Sally. I don't like Sue very much. And we do that from our earliest beginnings. If you're from a large family, and some may be, you have certain brothers or sisters whom you hold very dear, and others you have as little to do with as possible. And not over the issues of politics, over the issues of personality. Well, Washington warns against this. And no, I didn't read the entire section, nor will I. It goes on and on. Washington makes one of his biggest and longest points in opposing political parties. He goes on from there to talk about the necessity for maintaining the separation of powers. He begins actually not with Congress, the presidency, and the courts, but with the cabinet. Let all of the cabinet officers confine themselves to their own field of discipline. They didn't have a Secretary of the Interior. They had a U.S. Land Office at that time, where you could, by the way, buy land for about $1.25 an acre. But they didn't have a Secretary of the Interior. However, they did have a Secretary of State, and Washington is saying here in veiled sense, the Secretary of State should confine himself to matters of diplomacy. The diplomatic corps, we didn't have a State Department as such, but the diplomatic corps, that should be just dealing with diplomacy. They shouldn't be telling General Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, what the War Department ought to do. General Henry Knox should confine himself, in turn, to military affairs. And the Postmaster General should worry about running the post office. They believed that having one dominant personality, and in many presidential administrations since that time, we've had the dominating individual in the cabinet who is sort of head and shoulders intellectually above everyone else, that he's going to start telling everybody else what to do. Here, let me help you with that. If you've ever been a member of a committee and one person is assigned one role and then starts doing your role as well, you know how dangerous that can be. Oh, here, I know how to do all this. There is a danger to that because, again, you're dealing with a kind of personality that is acquisitive, that acquires. And that sort of personality needs to be kept in check. Otherwise, one person will be running the whole show, and it doesn't always end up being a person who was elected. It can be a person who was appointed to a position and is so strong in his knowledge and personality that he can run everything else. Be aware of that. And also, he does talk about the interloping of one branch of government with another. Washington, by the way, believed that the veto should be used only if a president found a bill passed by Congress to be starkly unconstitutional. If a president did not agree with a bill passed by Congress, he could allow it to pass without his signature, which was his way of showing public disapproval. You want it, you got it, but I'm not putting my name on this thing. But he had to let it pass, because the legislature should legislate and the president should not legislate. So it meant the president should allow bills to become law even if he didn't like them, unless he could find something in them that he felt was purely unconstitutional. And as for the courts should be the most passive of all. The courts are the passive branch of government because they have to have a case. A case has to come to them before they can make a ruling, but the courts should confine themselves to that narrow ruling and should never legislate from the bench. In other words, it's the same as with the cabinet. Everyone stays within their own natural sphere of influence. That's what they do. That's what they're supposed to do. It's their area of expertise. They should have that area of expertise, but they should not challenge the other areas of which they have no authority and over which they exercise no control. Now, next he says something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but that's okay. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life? If the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on the minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric. Now, that's another point that he makes in at least two long paragraphs. And his point there is that, as John Adams later said, the Constitution was designed for exercise by a religious people and is wholly insufficient to the governance of any other. Without religion, you're not going to last very long in a country like this. You'll deteriorate and degenerate to nihilism. Whether someone likes religion or not, and he's not specific here in religion, he's speaking of Christianity because it's primarily a Christian country at that time, but he's staying away from denominationalism. He's not advocating a particular church. Washington wasn't overly zealous in church attendance himself, but he's arguing for religious morality. And he could, and this is very interesting to me, he could have just said, and we find it rather easier to take, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. He could have just said morality, and then we wouldn't have to deal with the religion issue at all. But he didn't. He specifically mentioned religion. In other words, your personal morality, my compass tells me I should do this, is irrelevant to George Washington without a religious basis, without some basis in faith. And he argues for the necessity of religion in maintaining public decency, security of property, security for life, that if you don't have that, you're not going to be secure in any of those things ultimately. The fact is that Washington saw America as a fundamentally religious society. Now, it differed in many expressions of that religion, but he saw that as being essential, as being necessary for the survival of the country. And he spent a great deal of time trying to warn us about the loss of religion and morality in public life. You all know, I think by now, that the term separation of church and state is not found in any government documents anywhere at any time. It is taken from a private letter that Thomas Jefferson actually wrote to a Baptist pastor because the Baptists were claiming discrimination, and he was saying, well, the state shouldn't be able to interfere with your practice of your Baptist faith. There should be a separation between church and state. By that, he didn't mean separation of all religion or faith and state. And again, Jefferson was not a religious man in an orthodox sense. He was a deist. But the fact is that some standard of morality, some basis upon which to anchor our deeds, is necessary, or we're all over the map. Now, what's even more interesting to me is he follows this up with a paragraph on education. Promote, then, as an object of primary importance, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge in proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion. It should be enlightened. That's it. That's how much he thinks of education compared to religion. I went through college and graduate school, and I can tell you I met an awful lot of educated fools. They're still out there. And it has dampened my appreciation, to some extent, for higher education. I know some people who have become so intellectual that they are no earthly good. They can pontificate for hours on some obscure point, such as the use of the barricade in 18th century French street fighting, and couldn't screw in a light bulb. A lot of these guys couldn't organize their way out of a phone booth, but they want to tell you how you should run your life. Well, education is important. If we're going to have citizens vote, they should know something. So he says, oh yeah, you ought to have some schools too. And then he moves on. That's all he said. Well, yes, but the world's so complex. You know, we need higher ed. That's what they said back in the 1920s when everybody had to go to high school. Well, it's so, well, I don't know. I will tell you that if you want to read letters from Civil War wives to their husbands on the battlefield, you're reading letters from ladies living in cabins on the edge of the frontier, homesteading, who had no more than a few years of education in a one-room school with a teacher who was probably only a couple of years older than they were, and those letters read like poetry. Don't take my word for it, read them. And I don't think we have very many people in this country today who could write anywhere near as well as those quote-unquote uneducated women could write. So with all the money we throw at it and all of the beautiful facilities we have for ourselves, our kids are a sorry lot for the most part compared to what we once had. So it's not just the education. You can offer tools to people. It's using the tools in the toolbox and knowing how to know which tool to use. Well, he moves on from there to advise something else. As a very important source of strength and security, establish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it. And do not ungenerously throw upon posterity the burden that we ourselves ought to bear. Stay out of debt. Maintain good credit. Don't spend more than comes in. Some of you who may be from old Milwaukee families may remember that we had some socialist mayors in Milwaukee earlier in the 20th century. Emil Seidel, elected in 1912. Dan Hone, who served from 1916 to 1940. Frank Zeidler, who was mayor from 1948 to 1960. And I'll tell you something about those old socialist mayors. Socialism is a trigger word for a lot of people, but those fellows are long passed away, and their view of socialism is not what some of these people in Congress think socialism is today. Milwaukee was on a pay-as-you-go system under Mayor Hone, and he never spent any money that he didn't have already in the city treasury. If they ran out of money to plow the snow, they didn't plow any snow until they had more money. Pay-as-you-go. Dan Hone wasn't far from George Washington in that sense. Washington says, don't spend what you don't have. Have good credit. If you have to fight at some point, some timely disbursements to build up an army and a navy might be profitable for you in the future, but do not ever throw upon the next generation, your posterity, what you ought to pay for. We all know that with a relative who passed away and left an estate that was more debts than assets. And what do we do with that? Well, we have a country that's done that. It makes your old Aunt Millie and her extreme spending habits and her gambling addiction look like nothing. But Washington says don't do that. Don't go into debt. Now he also says something that bothers the libertarians among us. He says the execution of these maxims, in other words, of staying out of debt and paying your way and so forth, belongs to your representatives, but it is necessary that public opinion should cooperate. And to facilitate to them the performance of their duty, it is essential that you should practically bear in mind that towards the payment of debt, there must be revenue. And that to have revenue, there must be taxes. And that no taxes can be devised which are not more or less inconvenient and unpleasant. And the intrinsic embarrassment inseparable from the selection of the proper object, which is always a choice of difficulties, ought to be a decisive motive for a candid construction of the conduct of the government in making it, and for a spirit of acquiescence in the measures for obtaining revenue, which the public may at any time dictate. Now, what we have here is a statement that is repeated by the old maxim. There's nothing more sure than death and taxes. You have to have. You're going to have to pay into the pot. I know there's some people that don't think so. There was a guy back in the 1970s by the name of Red Beckman who wrote a book, How to Avoid Paying the IRS and Stay Out of Jail. I knew somebody who was a friend of his, a fellow named Roy, and I said to Roy, what's Beckman doing now? He said, oh, he's in jail. I had a very good friend up in Sheboygan, an otherwise minded fellow who decided that he would recalculate his property taxes every year and pay only what he felt he owed. Well, the city waited until he was in his 70s and had 20% eyesight, and then he wasn't much of a danger of throwing a punch at anybody anymore, and they evicted him from his house for back taxes. I never thought it would come up like this, he told me. And I said to him, how'd you not see that coming? And he said, well, I only have 20% eyesight. I said, well, okay. At any rate, neutrality in trade. Observe good faith and justice towards all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin us to this conduct, and can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period a great nation to give mankind the magnanimous example of too novel an expression of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Who can doubt that in the course of time and things, the fruits of such a plan would richly repay any temporary advantages which might be lost by a steady adherence to it? In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded. Now, he hit both sides there. Teddy Roosevelt said many years later, men who love other countries as much as they love their own remind me of men who love other women as much as their wives. While Washington wasn't quite that blunt, he's saying the same thing. If this country is not first in your hearts, you should live in the country that is. And one thing we have that has always been around, and people think it's new, and it isn't new. My family, they were German, and they came here, they were Achtenfersingers. They came here after the failed German revolutions of 1848, when the Frankfurt Assembly fell apart. My great-great-grandfather came to Milwaukee and opened one of the first blacksmith shops here, and made a pretty good money because he opened it next door to what became the Pabst Brewery. He was able to, well, he shot all of the draft horses for the brewery. Well, at any rate, I had family members who were very German. My great-grandmother said she didn't come here to learn an inferior language like English when she already spoke a far better language like German. And she never would learn proper English. The fact is that some people come here for economic gain, but culturally and intellectually, they're still very attached to where they've come from. And it is not something new. The Poles on the south side of Milwaukee in the 1900s, the Germans in the late 19th century, the Irish who came here, the Irish didn't want to leave Ireland. That was part of the problem. 5 million of them came to America because of the potato famine. They didn't want to go. They had to come or they would starve. But they didn't want to leave Ireland. I know some Irishmen in 2022 who still haven't left Ireland. Go up to Monches sometime. Run into them. They're more interested in what went on last week in Dublin than they are in what went on last week in Washington. But the fact is that you got to let that go. And if it is that important, you should really go back there. You can get us in all sorts of trouble if you love another country as much as your own. The practice of dual citizenship, which started with Israel, but then eventually encompassed Ireland and other countries, and now there's all sorts of countries where Greece and so on, where you can have dual citizenship. I find that a rather nefarious thing. Because if Greece was so bad that you had to leave, why do you want some citizenship there? But Washington is saying that's going to get us in trouble. You say, well, they can't do that to Greece, or they can't do that to Israel, or they can't do that to Ireland. Well, we had a problem with that with the British at one time, with the Irish in America voting very strongly for their own self-interest back in Ireland. Now, your personal politics are your personal politics. But the fact is that loving another country as much as you love America can suck us into a situation where we can't manage ourselves properly. We're suddenly committed to something that, why are we committed to it? The greatest example of that in all of American history is World War I. Well, what about the hatred of another country? It's two sides to the same coin. There's some people who hate another country so much that they want American policy permanently aligned against that other nation, and that will get us in as much trouble as loving the other nation. And Washington says, don't do either one. God has separated us from the rest of the world with two great oceans. You think this is an accident, or do you think maybe he wanted to give us a leg up in remaining separate from all the problems elsewhere in the world? And Washington goes on to say Europe has a set of interests primarily which are none of our concern. In other words, they have hostilities that have gone back years and years and years and continued long after his death. So you're not involved on either side of that. At the beginning of World War I, King Constantine of Greece said to his people, this does not concern the Greeks. He looked at what was going on in Serbia, Austria, France, England, Belgium, Germany. It doesn't concern us. The Greek parliament overrode his thinking and committed Greek troops to that war. Greek boys died in that war. Greece didn't get a lot out of it. But the fact is, they became involved. Well, love for another country is self-fulfilling, and rank hatred is short-sighted and self-fulfilling. If you hate another country, everything they do, see, I told you, they're up to it again. And if you love another country, well, of course they had to do this. It becomes something that creates special friends and inveterate enemies. And it also allows for foreign influence upon American politicians. There are foreign lobbies that operate in Washington. George Washington somehow foresaw that. Trade, yes, but political connections, no. Trade with all. Washington would have frowned on most favored nation status. He would have argued that everybody should get the same deal in trade, and that way there'd be no hurt feelings among the other nations that didn't get the same deal the last nation got. Our detached and distant situation, Washington says, is a divine blessing. Why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand on foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, and caprice? No permanent alliances. He does argue for temporary coalitions if it's necessary for a particular purpose, but it would be like an ad hoc committee for the purpose of, and once the purpose is completed, the committee would dissolve, well, so would the alliance. Don't expect foreign favors without strings attached. When another country does something for you, it's clear they're going to want some help in return. And he concludes, in offering you, my countrymen, these counsels of an old and affectionate friend, I dare not hope that they will make the strong and lasting impression that I could wish, that they will control the usual current of the passions or prevent our nation from running the course which has hitherto marked the destiny of all nations. But if I may even flatter myself that they may be productive of some partial benefit, some occasional good, that they may now and again modify the fury of party spirit, warn against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue, guard against the impostatures of pretended patriotism, then this hope will be a full recompense for the solicitude of your welfare by which they have been dictated. Relying on the kindness in this as in other things, and actuated by that fervent love toward my country which is so natural to a man who views in it the native soil of himself and his progenitors for several generations, I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize without alloy in the midst of my fellow citizens the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever favorite object of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers. And he says, in an upright zeal, may the faults of my incompetent abilities be consigned to oblivion, as I myself must soon be confined to the mansions of rest. He would die at age 67, 3 years after writing those things. Well, I hurried to finish us up because my feet are getting tired. If my feet are tired, you are tired elsewhere. So it's probably in your mind you'd like to move around a little, but I wanted to share with you as much as I could from the farewell address, and it's great reading. If you want to read the whole thing, you'd find it online very easily. And I would read the whole thing if I were you. It can tell you much more than what I'm able to tell you in the context of a short lecture. But I would advise this. As all of the points are being raised, one after another, ask yourself, have we done this? And you will find at the end of reading the farewell address that George Washington's advice did not end up being followed. We have done none of the things he advised us. We have done the things he advised us against, and we have failed to do any of the things he has advised us to do. If ever there was a prophet without honor, it was George Washington. We didn't do anything he asked us to do. We did all the things he told us not to do. We ignored his warnings. And when you do, you reap the whirlwind. Well, thanks for listening.